Alright, for some of you, this is the moment that you've been waiting for. In many ways, Book 7 of the Republic is the most famous, but it's also the most difficult part of the Republic, insofar as it involves the most kind of abstract metaphysics and epistemology. But it does also have a bunch of famous bits in it. It has the bit about the form of the good, and of course it starts with the passage about the cave. Now, what I'm going to do in this lecture is not actually spend a lot of time on those analogies. Scholars have for a long time debated about what they actually mean, so what I'm going to do is give you what I think is the context surrounding those analogies. I'm going to tell you what I think the rest of the theory is doing in Book 7, and then I'll kind of leave it up to you to work out how it is that the images that Plato provides fits in with the bigger theory. I think far too often scholars lose sight of what forms especially are supposed to be doing in Plato's theory, and too few people ask the question as to how it is that this training, this very abstract mathematical training, is supposed to make you a better person and a better ruler. Because after all, that's what we're doing in this part of the Republic. We're asking what the philosopher is and why they need a particular training in order to become good and knowledgeable people. So our focus is going to be looking at what the point of all this is, and I'll leave it up to you to fill in the gaps about how it works with all the images. We already saw that in Books 2 and Book 3 that the people who are going to go on to be guardians have to really succeed at their musical and gymnastic education. But in Book 7, we get the rest of the education scheme, and it lasts for over 30 years. Fortunately, Plato gives us a lot of details about what's actually involved in this. So let's check it out. We've already seen that since birth, children in Callipolis are going to be using mathematics in their games. This isn't formal study of mathematics, but it is going to teach them basic mathematical principles through their play. It's also clear that they're going to get what we called music, so stories and various kinds of group activities, like dancing, that are going to help develop their musical capabilities. Now, what Plato adds in Book 7 is there is apparently an intense period of gymnastics and military training from ages 18 to 19. Now, the text doesn't say so explicitly, but I think we can infer from other passages in Plato, particularly the Laws, that gymnastics, like music, is actually something that happens continually throughout the guardian's life. But Plato flags this particular passage, 18 to 19, as a period where they'll be doing such intense gymnastics that it will be hard for them to do anything else, basically because they'll be so sore and tired. What's of interest to us today, though, is what happens after this. What happens when you've finished your musical and gymnastic education and you go on to the higher studies? From ages 20 to 29, the students in Callipolis start doing proper mathematical studies, no longer just using it in their play, but doing formal study of arithmetic, geometry, and harmonics. Now, again, this is a specialized mathematical training for 10 years. It looks like they're just focusing on that one field. At age 30 is when they start doing something that's recognizably philosophy, and Plato calls this dialectic. You do that for 5 years, and then what you do is 15 years of practical training in politics and the sciences. In that sense, the theoretical training that you've just had for 15 years and the basic principles of mathematics and the basic principles of philosophy is complemented by empirical study in the world. Now, this is important. Lots of people think that Plato is a purely a priori reasoner, someone who doesn't care much for empirical study. But note here, 15 years is dedicated to practical training, actually taking time in office in politics, and actually going out into the world and doing sciences. At age 50, they finally start doing what is called advanced dialectic, the highest principles of philosophy. And it's at this point that hopefully people will start to understand the forms, and then assuming they complete that training, it's only at this point that the philosophers are able to rule. In that sense, nobody is going to be a ruler in Callipolis until they're at least 50. The first thing to note about this general education scheme is that you can't actually progress to more advanced levels of study until you've completed what you might call your character education. The point of music and gymnastics was to give you a good character, to turn you into someone who's likely oriented towards the right things and who has the right values. In that sense, Plato really wants people to be good people before they're clever people. He's worried, as we saw in Book 6, about people abusing their powers of reasoning and abusing the powers of argumentation to corrupt other people. His solution to this, then, is not to have people just jump into philosophy right away, but to have a good, solid training first, making them good people. And then only once they're already kind of have a decent character, can we then give them the philosophical tools, basically, to make them clever. One way you can understand what's going on here is that Plato might have recognized a failure in the Socratic project. Socrates went around asking anybody he could find questions about what the various virtues were and about what it meant to live a good life. But he found that in asking these people questions, not everybody responded well. In fact, a lot of people responded really hostilely, and of course Socrates was put to death on charges of corrupting the youth. Plato's solution is to have people hold off on kind of Socratic conversations, Socratic dialectic, until later in the education process. It's not until you have well-established values that you should learn how to refute other people, and you should learn how to give objections to arguments. In that sense, it seems like Plato is really concerned with what other people in his society were doing, using argument and using philosophical reasoning to get to conclusions that Plato thought were morally corrupting. Here's one example that we see in Herodotus's histories, an example of an argument that I think Plato would hate. When Darius was king, he summoned the Greeks who were with him and asked them for what price they would eat their fathers' dead bodies. They answered that there was no price for which they would do it. Then Darius summoned those Indians who are called Calatii, who eat their parents, and asked them, the Greeks being present and understanding through interpreters what was said, what would make them willing to burn their fathers at death. The Indians cried aloud that he should not speak of so horrid an act. So firmly rooted are these beliefs, and it is, I think, rightly said in Pindar's poem, that custom is lord of all. What some people have taken from this passage is that Herodotus and Darius are presenting an argument for moral relativism. The thought is the Greeks burn their dead, and the Indians eat their dead, and that each society thinks that the other practice is morally abhorrent. Now, to young and impressionable minds, these arguments are very persuasive. And so in that sense, being exposed to these kinds of arguments for moral relativism before you have good values established is going to be corrupting. It's going to make you think that really there's no such thing as justice. Of course, philosophers later on in Plato's education are going to learn how to refute those arguments. For example, someday I might point out that although there are different practices for how it is that you respect their dead, both societies think that respecting the dead and respecting their ancestors is important. So what might look like an argument for moral relativism on the face of it actually turns out to be a kind of objective account of value. Namely, what's important is that you respect your parents and your ancestors. But how exactly you do that might vary from culture to culture. Okay, so we have some information about what it is that the Guardians are actually going to study as part of their higher education. And I think what's really important to see here is the pattern of the steps that they're going through. Now we have to fill in some details here, but hopefully what I'll be able to do is give you an idea of how each stage gets progressively more abstract and progressively more difficult forms of reasoning. Now bear with me here, I know this can be a little bit dry, but trust me, there'll be a big payoff at the end. Because if you can see why Plato puts so much weight in abstract reasoning and abstract mathematics, you'll see something really cool about how he thinks about ethics and how he thinks about life more generally. The philosophical education starts with mathematics. Now, this was broken down into a few subsections that Plato mentions. The first is arithmetic: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, the basic stuff that we kind of do early on. He then talks about plane geometry, which is 2D geometry. Here, this is considered a different branch of mathematics because the tools are different. In particular, the students are going to start getting an idea of how you do ratios. So a lot of geometrical reasoning in ancient Greece took the form of A is to B as C is to D, and so forth. So they're learning about the relationship between quantities. Now, the more advanced version of that is three-dimensional geometry. So not just working with stuff on 2D, like triangles and circles, but working with cubes and spheres and cones. Students at this stage start to get exposed to kind of basic principles of reasoning. The idea is when you're working through a mathematical problem, you have to work step by step and you have to work logically. But what you're working with are pretty abstract things. They're numbers or letters that are acting as placeholders. So again, it's at a very abstract level. It's not dealing with stuff in the world yet, which is obviously going to get more complicated. It's at this point that students are going to start to get the tools that are going to be really important later on. For example, they're going to learn how to hypothesize a definition and then test it. They're going to learn how to write proofs. So again, at a very basic but importantly abstract level, they're going to learn how to define things, they're going to learn how to prove things, and they're going to learn how to test a particular mathematical hypothesis. For the students who do well in these 10 years of mathematics, they then get to move on to the next stage, which is when the students start doing more philosophical kinds of logic and reasoning. And this is called dialectic. Now, when we did mathematics, we were dealing with really abstract things, numbers, lines, shapes. What happens when you get to dialectic is you then start to apply those principles to sentences. So just as the students learn to prove particular things about mathematical properties, they're then going to start to apply those properties to propositions. So working out how it is that there's a logical relationship, not just between numbers and letters, but between sentences, between particular terms. It's also likely that they start to do what Plato calls elsewhere the methods of collection and division. So collection is working out what all the things that are similar have in common. So working out what it is that all mammals have in common or all animals have in common. Division, by contrast, is working out what things which would otherwise be grouped together actually separate. So, for example, working out not just what all mammals have in common, but what separates each of the mammals, thus breaking mammals down into various species. So collection is working out what things have in common, and division is working out what separates things. Now, obviously, if you're trying to categorize animals, it's going to be important that you do this in an orderly and methodical fashion. Not just any division is going to be a relevant division, and not just any difference is going to be a relevant difference. So the students are going to start learning what kinds of things unify particular classes and what kinds of things separate particular classes. So again, we can see that the mathematical reasoning is then starting to take on a more robust form. We're not just dealing with numbers and abstract entities, we're starting to deal with things in the world. But still on a pretty theoretical level. We don't want to apply it yet, we're just learning the basic principles of logic, we're learning the basic principles of philosophy. Assuming you pass your philosophy prereqs, you can move on to what can be considered the kind of grad school of Plato's education system. For the next 15 years, between the ages of 35 and 50, the students get exposed to practical matters in politics and the sciences. Let's start with the politics because it's pretty easy what's happening here. It's obvious that they're going to be holding kind of minor offices in the cities. They're going to be involved in politics, learning how things work. Basically, they're doing internships. So they're understanding the practicalities of how politics works. On the more scientific side, it's clear that at this stage they're going to start learning more about the natural world. So for example, they'll probably start taking courses in mechanics, learning how it is that bodies act in motion, the kinds of things that we learn in physics classes. It also seems to be at this stage that they start doing more astronomy and harmony. So think about this. Astronomy is kind of the study of bodies in motion in the heavens, in the celestial realm, which is what we call astronomy. But it's also clear that they're going to advance their mathematical studies in music theory. This is going to involve doing actual harmonic studies and getting into what you might call theoretical harmonics. Now, as a music theory nerd, I really have to restrain myself here. But one of the things that Plato noticed is that musical properties, namely intervals that are harmonious, tend to have particular kind of mathematical ratios. In that sense, music theory for Plato is kind of an advanced form of mathematics. Just as geometry looked at simple ratios, harmony looks at more complex ratios. So for example, just to give a really easy example, the interval of a perfect fifth is a ratio of 3 to 2. And what Plato wants to do is get his students to work out which kinds of mathematical ratios actually end up sounding good. Now, this is normal harmony. Plato wants to expand the curriculum to get into theoretical harmonics as well, looking at how you can form more complex ratios that have the same good properties that make the easy ratios harmonious. So Plato now is getting really interested in which kinds of ratios manifest as beauty and which kinds of ratios manifest as goodness. And harmonics is the realm that we start to explore this. So harmonics is really important for that reason. It teaches students which ratios are good and which ratios are beautiful. The last stage of education, which starts when you're 50 and you have to pass everything before then with flying colours, is what we could call advanced dialectic. It's at this stage where the philosophers are really getting into abstract forms of definition, coming up with the definitions of justice, of goodness, of beauty. It's also at this stage that they're going to start doing really high-level philosophical proofs, not just proving basic propositions, but proving really complex propositions that a lot hangs on. It's also clear that at this stage they're going to get really into pretty serious argumentation and refutation. So they're going to learn how to defend their hypotheses. They're going to learn how to knock down other people's arguments. Of course, they're going to be really solid in their grounding by this stage, so Plato doesn't seem to think that it's going to be a concern that people are going to learn how to use argument in ways which could potentially be abused. It's also at this stage that the philosophers are going to start learning what forms and first principles are. Now, we'll talk about those in the next video because I'm sure you have questions about them. But just note that at this stage, when they're finally 50, they start to do the really high-level philosophy. And then after they graduate from this, they can finally start taking turns in ruling the city themselves. So it's only after they have over 50 years of education that Plato thinks that they're going to be qualified in order to rule the city. It's also worth noting that he thinks that this is the stage at which the most people are going to drop out. Only very few people are going to pass this final stage and thus be qualified to be philosopher rulers. So let's try to summarize the main stages. What's kind of the main point at each level? It's clear that at first the thing that Plato is testing for is basic abstract reasoning. Are these the kind of people who are capable in engaging in theoretical reasoning? Namely, are they people who can work well with diagrams, with models, with representations of things that happen in the real world? Starting first with things like shapes and magnitudes, but moving on to more abstract things as they go through. Now, some people just completely lose track of the argument and lose track as soon as there isn't a practical application. These are the kinds of people who can't move easily from talking about adding and subtracting apples and oranges to using A's and B's and X's and Y's. So you have to be good at abstract reasoning. You then need to be able to apply that in the real world, seeing how those same structures, namely the kinds that you use in proofs and the kinds that you use in mathematical demonstrations, can be applied to areas like politics and biology and questions about ethics. So if you can't move from the abstract reasoning to a kind of more applied phase where you see the same abstract structures in the real world, you won't be able to make it through that middle stage. Of course, things start getting really messy when you get into the real world. It's harder to get everything to fit together tidily. This is why it is that so few people make it through the final stage. You need to be able to get to a stage where you can explain complex kinds of orders, where you can explain complex relationships between things. Not just A is to B is to C, where there are only 3 units, but when there are lots of things that go into that. It's the final stage that is going to be the most difficult. And of course, lots of people just give up at this stage. Even very talented philosophers think, well, maybe there's no way to explain what all instances of beauty have in common, or all instances of goodness. But Plato thinks that this is the reason that it's the hardest stage, is you need to take the simple logical and mathematical structures and then find how they apply in a very complex world. And that's the point of the final stage of education. Okay, this has already gone on for way too long, so let's take a break here, and then in the next video I'll do part 2, where I'll explain what I think forms are and how they fit into this education system. And then I'll explain what the ethical and political upshot is supposed to be. I'll try to explain why it is that mathematics is supposed to help you understand goodness and beauty.